Hello, everybody. I'm Andrew Bear, and this is The Hype Mind. Welcome back. Today we have a guest with us again, Sophia, and we have got a great topic for you today. We're going to be discussing liberalism and what it is and what it means to be liberal, and possibly more importantly, we're going to make a couple big distinctions about liberalism. So, without further ado, Sophia, I'm curious because you attend a liberal arts school, right? You've been attending one for several years. So what's your definition, or what's the textbook's definition of the liberal arts and liberalism from that perspective?
Yeah, so etymologically, speaking about what the word kind of liberal even means, it comes from the Latin liber, which means free. And so that word has connotations, of freedom in some sense. And so in the political sphere, that's developed to mean one thing, and then in the academic sphere, that's developed to mean something else. And so academically, when we talk about the liberal arts, it has nothing to do with political liberalism, at least not directly.
Right.
And it usually pertains to this idea. Originally, the word liberal arts literally just meant arts having to do with a free man, right? Whereas the servile arts were arts having to do with kind of a slave. And the slaves were the ones who would do the work to, kind of satisfy basic needs.
So when you say arts having to do with a free man, can you break that down a little more?
Yeah. So and by art, I mean really study, right? Mm-hmm. So the servile arts were studies and things that you learn to do for the sake of kind of maintaining your life, right? Mm-hmm. So everything from farming to, I don't know.
The liberal arts are not a necessity, so to speak. More like a hobby. Yeah.
Yeah. And so the Freemen were the only people who were able to kind of study them because they were the only ones who didn't have to spend all of their time providing for their basic needs. Their basic needs were provided for them. And so they were able to kind of devote their time to things that were thought to be very meaningful in themselves, right? So the pursuit of truth, right? Not just in the very practical sense. And so, so traditionally the seven liberal arts were grammar, logic, rhetoric, geometry, arithmetic, astronomy, and music, but they were studied in ways that were more contemplative rather than practical, right? So astronomy would be very different than the astronomy that we study in school.
And break that down a little more too. You say contemplative rather than practical because, obviously because it's not so much about the necessity, mm-hmm. but yeah, go into greater detail.
Yeah. So Aristotle says that all men by nature desire to know, right? Mm-hmm. And I think we can all recognize that it's good to know what is true, right? And the more we come to know what is true, the more we are also in turn formed by that realization. And so there is kind of a practical aspect in seeking the truth. And it definitely should form you as a person. But for instance, right, if I was, in STEM or in science today, I'm oftentimes, my academic life would be almost utilitarian in a certain sense, right? I'm studying for the sake of conducting experiments, for the sake of being able to, produce this particular thing. I don't know.
Right.
And servile arts are also what we think of most in most colleges. So anything having to do directly with a career is almost always connected in some way to what the medievals and the Renaissance would have considered something practical, right? It's a means to an end. I'm learning this so that I can do this, so that I can make money, right?
Yeah. It's about survival. It's about mm-hmm. work. Yeah, for sure. Those are like you said, your normal degrees that people work towards.
Yeah, and that's not
for
bad.
The purpose of working, right? No, not at all.
No, not at all, right?
Or like a technical school, right? And so, what do you study as a liberal arts student? What's in your,
Yeah. So we have a humanities curriculum, which is a combination of literature, philosophy, history. And we basically just go through this timeline. We start with the Greeks, we read the Iliad, we read the Odyssey, we read the Greek plays, we read Aristotle, Plato, right? And we move through time. But then we also, we study physics, astronomy, geometry, biology, but we study them it's not an anti-scientific, right? There is math involved. But for instance,
just an understanding of it.
just understanding. And so for instance, like, the theorem a² + b² = c², right? We're handed this theorem when we study geometry, oftentimes in high school, right? But we go through the whole history of how that theorem came to be and the logic.
Right, you really question it. You ask the whys. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I can prove to you logically why that works, because it's Euclid. And studying Euclid in that way teaches you also, we think about, okay, how is this logical proof working, right? How are our minds learning to grasp this? What are the different kinds of knowledge? So basically every existential question you have, we talk about, and those are important, questions. And I think oftentimes people will go through their life without necessarily having a sense of any real answer to those questions, and get to a certain point where they've got a career, they've got kind of their life all figured out, but there's still these lingering things that they haven't had the opportunity to explore. And that's what this is meant to be, is something that should enrich your life in more than just kind of a very practical, way. So I don't know, does that at all answer?
No, that's so. Well, here's what I gathered from that, right? By my own definition, liberalism is a means of study, or for the purpose of knowing and understanding. It's a self-education solely for the information, where it's not really. It can be applied to life. It matters. It's important, but it's not necessarily for survival, although it does benefit survival. It's like brownie points. I get it. Yeah, I guess you could say it.
Yeah. And it's more than just this kind of attempt at accumulating facts, right?
It's an understanding of it.
Yeah. And it's this, and it really, if you're doing it right, it should be this entrance into this conversation, right? Because the questions that you think about as a human being, all humans have thought about, and people have devoted their lives writing about, and not everyone is right by any means, right? That's why it's a great conversation. Right. But being able to enter into that and hear what Dante has to say, and not just dismissing Dante because sometimes he's difficult to read, or understanding what happened with the Greeks. Like, why do we talk about Aristotle and Plato? Why does that matter? And when you read them, oftentimes, at least for me, like encountering those texts, I was like, oh, they're just as much human as I am. Like, these are questions that I personally am asking. And this was 2,000 years ago, and they were sitting around their togas talking about this, right? And so you begin to feel like you're part of this community. And I think that's something also that our culture lacks, because, we can oftentimes just kind of be on our own with all of these, mounting questions. It's like, no, like everyone asks these questions.
We keep to our cliques and our groups. It really seems like, it's a means of enhancement. Well, it's not necessary. It is necessary if you want. It really comes off as the road to fine tune your life. It's like, well, you will definitely get from point A to point B, but if you add a study and and embrace the idea of what the liberal arts offer, and what classical liberalism, right? Is that the appropriate term for that? Or is that another thing?
I think that's more political, but I could be wrong.
Okay. So, but anyway, if you accept this and dive into this, then you're able to not just walk the road of life. You're able to more inform, in a more informed manner, in a more conscious manner. You're able to walk the road of life, possibly improve the road of life while you walk it. And maybe it's not even just a road. Now you make it into a staircase of life. It comes off as very beneficial, although unnecessary, depending on how you want to see that. You could live without it, but
and I think I would agree with that to a certain extent, but also I think it's a lot more necessary than people think.
Right. Oh yeah, no, I don't want to. See, that's the thing, is like, I don't mean unnecessary, because
it's not.
I would argue you need it. I would argue, like, if you really want to be successful and happy and and have a purpose-driven life, and be grateful, and be just overall really be open and embrace and loving with life and what you have, then you really do need the liberal arts. But it's like, but technically, if you did exclude the liberal arts from your life for the rest of your life, you would make it, you could still make it from point A to point B, whatever point B is, the end of life, your definition of success or your goal. But it's like, it's not just an enhancement. It really is a necessary enhancement. It really is something you want to embrace
Yeah.
and you
I
should
think
want.
Yeah, I think we have a really hard time articulating things that are good, but not good in the purely utilitarian, this is keeping me alive or making me money sense.
Right.
And so I think we would articulate it as something that is a common good and something that we recognize, I'm not talking just strictly about, going to college to study the liberal arts, right? And there are plenty of places that, kind of will claim to, but don't necessarily keep with the traditional model.
Hmm.
And so there are many different ways that these sorts of conversations and communities can arise in a person's life. But I think one of the greatest things that I have, been able to, greatest ways that I've been able to benefit from this education is learning to recognize like learning to examine the culture in which you live, right?
Hmm.
Because we're all gifted this set of values, right? Just
Right.
based on
Don't
where we
just
are.
walk the walk, embrace
Yeah.
the walk, understand the walk,
Yeah.
and
And
adapt it,
yeah.
build it up even greater than it is.
Yeah.
Don't just follow blind, maybe not blindly, but yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So
Um,
I think it often starts that
yeah.
process. But yeah, you were gonna say something, sorry.
So you said, you mentioned something about how it was like good, but it wasn't like that wasn't a good word. And honestly, the word that comes to mind is, I I would say that accepting liberalism and what it offers people isn't just good, because you can live a good life without these kind of, without that in-depth understanding of history, without the in-depth understanding of philosophy and theology and geometry and all this knowledge, right? But it's like, it is good, it's important, but you can also do without it and still be good. So the word that comes to mind when I think of that is it's the answer to virtuousness.
Mm.
Yeah,
That's
that
that's really
sounds rough saying
interesting.
that,
Yeah, because yeah, go ahead.
but I think it's like the next level. It's like, it's in the same category, but it's on a different it's on a different plane, or on a,
Yeah. Yeah, and that's what it's really interesting you say that, because that's basically what Aristotle says. Aristotle's ethics, he says all men want to be happy.
Mhm.
Everything that we do is because we think it's going to make us happy, right? And all of our actions are oriented towards an end. And then he goes
Mhm.
through this whole process and he says, man is a rational animal. This is the highest part of his being is his will and his reason. And so therefore his perfection comes through living that out in an ordered way, right? So through
Right.
virtue, through habit, through building these virtues
Not
and
just living it out.
yes, and living that virtuous life. But then at the end, he says that the highest thing for man is contemplation, which is a word that we just don't know what to do with, and just
Right.
think of just kind of sitting there thinking about the universe, and it's much more kind of tangible than we probably think. But that's really interesting because I think, yeah, I would say that it's maybe you could kind of call it a perfection. Um, because not everyone is called to that, in the same way. Although I think we all do, or ought to participate in that search for truth in different ways, and some more explicitly than others. But yeah, I would agree with that. I think that it's something that, yeah, especially for people who are called to that, or who tend to kind of question more in that way. Yeah, it can definitely be that kind of perfection.
So I'm chuckling because during your little spiel there, I just envisioned the Jeep tire covers where it's like life is good. And because you can live you can live a good life. You can live a good life without what the liberal arts have to offer. But it's like, but there's more to it. It's like,
Yeah.
that's the virtuous side of liberalism. That's why it's necessary. That's the contemplation that Aristotle, preaches as so important, is you could live a good life, or you could live a virtuous life, which is still a good life, but it's a good life oriented at something,
And I mean,
towards perfection, towards the highest good.
yeah. And I mean, I would say I mean, personally, I would say that you can't live a good life without virtue, because I don't think that you'll be happy unless in some way, and I don't mean that in a
Right.
narrow
Oh,
sense.
good. Like
Like you
good for
can live. I
society.
think
Might
it's
not
just
be
you
good
can
for
live a
you,
life.
but yeah.
You can
Well,
live
I
a
mean,
life.
life is good at all. To have any life is good inherently.
Absolutely. No, I
So
completely.
you're still living a good life, although like
Yes.
I agree with you. If you're not living life towards virtue, you're really not living a good life. But you are living a
Is
good
it?
life because you are living, and that
Yeah.
is inherently good.
So yeah, so there's another fun distinction, right, between kind
Yeah.
of our fundamental value as persons versus like our perfection. And
Right.
so, right, that fundamental value means that our lives are meaningful, even when we're not living them well, right, and that they're good simply because we do exist, and that's a good thing. But
So
then
can
also,
you, well, before we branch on to the or step into the next subject, can you define, just wrap that up, summarize that in your own words, what
yeah,
it means to you?
so the liberal arts to me are a study, not so much a study because that brings to mind kind of facts and note taking,
Hmm.
um, but a process by which an individual, through a community of other learners and other teachers, and any kind of an even greater conversation that is both outside of time and space, um, seeks the truth, and not in an abstract, kind of highfalutin
Yeah.
philosophical way, but in a very real human way, and learns to really encounter questions that are worth pursuing, and is formed by the answers to those questions and by that experience, such that it really, yeah, it affects you as a person. It affects how you see the world. It affects how you think about things. Um, and it's not just a toolkit, although it does give you tools. Um, but I would say that it's one of the greatest pursuits, precisely because it doesn't yield any inherent utilitarian benefit instantly, right? I'm not going to go make fantastic money off of this unless I become,
Right.
a really renowned professor, but I will
But
live a very full life.
yeah. Oh yeah.
And so I think, yeah, that affirmation that this is a good, that isn't just, yeah. So anyway,
What the word that comes to mind when you say that is transformational. It's
yes, absolutely.
transforming.
Yep.
It alters your life. It changes your life.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not a study, but it is a transformation.
Yeah. And it can be, right? That's a part
Yeah.
of it. I just didn't want it to, it's not just,
No. That was just a random thought that popped up in my head. And next time I need someone to write a paper for me, I'm going to ask you, because, whoo, if you type that, man. But fantastic.